Have you ever sat in a meeting and felt your stomach drop as someone else spoke the very words you had poured weeks of energy into? Not just the idea, but the structure, the phrasing, even the passion. It was yours. Yet somehow it came out of his mouth, polished and claimed as if he had conceived it overnight. And then came the applause, the nodding heads, the impressed murmurs, the board members leaning forward with excitement, while you sat in your chair frozen, invisible. What do you do in that moment? Do you speak up and risk looking petty? Do you stay quiet and swallow the betrayal? Or do you bide your time, waiting for the right chance to prove that no one can steal your voice forever? That was the dilemma I faced in a sterile boardroom on a rainy Tuesday morning. My manager, Mark, stood at the front, beaming with pride as he presented a project strategy I had built from scratch. I recognized every slide because I had stayed late designing them, adjusting the flow, ensuring the numbers told a story that would capture the board's attention. Yet there he was, casually dropping my idea into his speech as if it had been born in his brain while sipping coffee. I felt my chest tighten, my hands clench into fists under the table. And when the board erupted into applause at his innovation, I realized something chilling. In their eyes, it was not mine anymore. He owned it now. What followed was almost worse than the theft itself. After the meeting, Mark slapped me on the back like we were teammates, whispering, "Great work! We nailed it!" As if my reward was simply being allowed to watch him take credit. That night, lying awake staring at the ceiling, I replayed the moment again and again. Should I have spoken up? Should I have stood and said, "Actually, that was my project"? But in corporate culture, speaking up often brands you as difficult or uncooperative. I was not just fighting for my idea. I was fighting for my career, my future paycheck, my reputation. And so I stayed silent, simmering with anger, until that anger transformed into something else. Determination. I started noticing the pattern. This was not the first time Mark had used me as his shadow brain. Small ideas in meetings, clever phrasing in reports, even quick suggestions during brainstorming sessions. He absorbed them like a sponge and presented them later as his own. At first, I told myself that maybe it did not matter, that as long as the project succeeded, everyone would benefit. But then I noticed the promotions, the praise, the way executives began looking at him as a visionary. And every time he rose higher on the ladder, I remained in the same chair, invisible, applauding the very ideas I had birthed. It became clear. He was building his career on my silence. The breaking point came one afternoon when the CEO singled him out in front of the entire department. She said, "Mark, your proposal for scaling this project is one of the most promising strategies we have seen in years. We are eager to invest more resources in your vision." My vision, my strategy. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I thought I might be sick. That night, instead of stewing, I opened my laptop and reread the entire proposal from beginning to end. Every sentence was mine, every chart carefully crafted by me. In that moment, the question crystallized in my mind. Why was I handing my future to someone else when I could claim it for myself? The decision did not come overnight. Fear whispered in my ear. What if I failed? What if I left the security of my paycheck and crashed into debt? After all, Mark had the connections, the reputation, and the trust of the board. I had long hours, restless ambition, and a notebook full of unclaimed ideas. But slowly, fear gave way to clarity. If I stayed, my future would always belong to him. If I left, at least success or failure would be mine. I began sketching out a plan, not for the company, not for Mark, but for myself. For the first time, my late nights at the office became something different. They became the blueprint for my independence. Every night after work, I would pour myself a cheap cup of coffee, sit at my small kitchen table, and rebuild the proposal from the ground up. Not the sanitized version Mark had presented, but the full, daring, unfiltered plan. I expanded it, refined it, and added details I had never dared to show at work, fearing they would dismiss me as naive. Piece by piece, I watched my vision grow into something more powerful than a single project. It was the foundation of a company. And with every late night spent staring at glowing spreadsheets and sketches, my resolve hardened. I would no longer let Mark define my worth. Still, I knew I had to be careful. Leaving abruptly without preparation would have been suicide. I needed funding, allies, and a clear roadmap. I began discreetly reaching out to contacts I had built over the years, old colleagues, former clients, even friends who had once asked me for advice. I shared just enough to spark curiosity without revealing everything. Slowly, I started building a small network of believers, people who saw potential in me, not in Mark's version of my work. And as those quiet conversations turned into serious interest, the idea of walking away from the safety of my job no longer felt like a fantasy. It felt like destiny waiting to be seized. Meanwhile, at the office, Mark continued his parade of stolen brilliance. Each meeting became more painful, not because he was stealing my work, but because I no longer cared. I had detached myself from the circus. Every time the board clapped for him, I smiled quietly, knowing that what I was building outside those walls would eclipse any applause he could manufacture. It became almost amusing to watch him bask in praise, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already shifting. Because while he was busy building his career on borrowed ideas, I was building a future that belonged only to me. I started documenting everything, every draft, every note, every time-stamped version of my work. Not to confront him, but to protect myself. My apartment slowly filled with folders and binders, a secret archive of proof that the ideas were mine. That evidence gave me confidence, but it also gave me clarity. My goal was not revenge, my goal was freedom. The company would never see me as more than a tool for Mark to exploit. If I wanted my ideas to breathe, I had to set them free in my own way, and that meant preparing to walk out of that building and never look back. I began to notice how different I felt each morning walking into the office. Before, I used to arrive tense, hoping my work would finally be acknowledged, hoping that maybe this time Mark would not take what was mine. Now, I walked in calm, almost detached, because I knew the truth. This was not my final destination. Each email I answered, each report I polished, each meeting I endured was simply fuel for the fire I was building outside. My real job began when I left the office and opened my laptop at home. That perspective shift made the long hours bearable, even energizing, because I knew they were temporary. Then came the day when Mark tried to pull me even deeper into his shadow. He called me into his office, leaned back in his chair with a smug smile, and said, "I need you to start working on another presentation. The board loved the last one, and I want to keep that momentum going." I sat across from him, my hands folded tightly, and forced myself to nod. But inside, my resolve hardened further. I was done feeding his reputation. The work he demanded would not be another gift to his career. It would be the seed of my own. So instead of building the presentation exactly as he asked, I split my efforts in two. I gave him the polished but watered-down version, good enough to keep him satisfied but hollow at its core. And then, in secret, I built the real one. The stronger one. The one with the daring ideas. The one with the strategy that could actually shift the market. His version went into his briefcase. Mine stayed in my apartment, tucked safely in a binder that grew heavier by the week. Every hidden draft felt like I was taking back another piece of myself he had tried to own. The fear of discovery haunted me. I worried that he might glance at my computer, that someone might notice I was working late hours on projects that were not directly tied to my assignments. But paranoia kept me sharp. I saved files under plain names, used encrypted drives, and even printed hard copies to avoid digital trails. I lived with the constant weight of risk, but it was a risk I chose. Because the greater risk was doing nothing, watching my ideas disappear into his hands forever. Every time I thought about that possibility, the fear was replaced with fire. Months passed, and my secret work grew into something undeniable. I was no longer just refining a proposal. I was building the blueprint of a company. I had designed a service model, identified a target market, and even calculated the initial costs. My kitchen table became a war room of papers, charts, and sticky notes. I would sit there, exhausted but electrified, imagining what it would feel like to present this to investors, to say the words out loud and finally have them belong to me. For the first time in years, I felt alive in my work, not drained by it. I still had to endure Mark's charade in the meantime. He strutted through the office with confidence, bragging about how his strategies were shaping the company's future. I smiled politely when he spoke, even offered occasional suggestions that he eagerly pocketed. But I had stopped giving him my best. The difference between us grew wider with every passing week. He thought he was winning, but in truth, he was becoming weaker. Without my strongest ideas, his presentations became flatter, less inspiring. I watched executives' faces shift from excitement to polite nods. He had no idea his golden stream of brilliance was drying up. The turning point arrived during a networking event. I had been invited casually, and I almost skipped it, fearing it would be another evening of empty conversations. But something told me to go. That night, I met a woman who would change everything, a former executive who had left corporate life to invest in small startups. We began talking, and when she asked about my work, I hesitated. Then I decided to take a chance. I shared just a fraction of my vision, enough to show her the shape of it without giving it all away. Her eyes lit up. She leaned in and said, "If you ever decide to build this, call me." Those words followed me home like an anthem. I stared at my kitchen table, at the sea of notes and binders, and for the first time I believed not just that I could build something, but that someone else believed it too. That validation shifted the ground beneath me. It was no longer a secret fantasy. It was a possibility. And possibilities, once recognized, are impossible to forget. From that night on, every hour I spent working felt different. I was not just preparing. I was actively walking toward my escape. I began setting aside money quietly, cutting back on everything that was not essential. No more takeout meals, no spontaneous purchases, no weekend indulgences. Every dollar became a soldier I sent forward to fight for my independence. I lived simply, almost frugally, but with a sense of purpose I had never known before. Each saved dollar was another step away from Mark's shadow, another brick in the foundation of the life I was building. I told no one what I was doing. Outwardly, I seemed the same employee I had always been. Inwardly, I was transforming. Finally, I set a date. Not marked boldly on the calendar, but circled in my mind like a secret countdown. By then, I would have enough savings, enough preparation, and enough courage to make the leap. I walked into work each day with a quiet smile, knowing that soon I would no longer sit silently while Mark paraded my ideas as his own. Soon, the applause would belong to me, and for the first time, it would be earned honestly. I carried that secret like armor, and it made every betrayal easier to endure. Because I knew, deep down, my freedom was coming. The weeks leading up to my departure felt like living two separate lives. At the office, I played the role of loyal employee, nodding through meetings, preparing documents, and keeping my head down. At home, I was a founder in the making, sharpening my ideas, tightening my plan, and practicing the words I would one day say to investors. It was surreal, almost like acting in two different plays without letting the audiences know I was the same person. The longer I lived in that duality, the more I realized how much power I had been giving away for years. I was not just reclaiming my ideas, I was reclaiming myself. Mark remained blissfully unaware. He continued to call me into his office, assign me tasks, and present my diluted work as his own. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed the spark in me had changed. Maybe he was too arrogant, too confident in his control, to suspect that I was slipping away. His voice had lost its power over me. Every time he praised me with that false, condescending tone, I no longer felt rage. I felt amusement. I smiled, knowing that very soon, his empire built on my work would crumble without me holding it up. The day finally arrived when I could no longer keep my secret contained. I secured a small meeting with the investor I had met at the networking event, and this time, I brought everything. The binders, the charts, the real version of the proposal Mark had gutted down to mediocrity. I stood in front of her in a quiet office, my palms sweating, my voice shaking at first, and then steadying as passion took over. For the first time, I spoke my idea aloud as if it was mine, because it was. When I finished, she leaned back, smiled, and said, "You are sitting on something incredible. Let us build this." My heart raced. This was the moment my life changed. We began working quietly together, mapping out funding, legal steps, and the first stages of forming the company. It felt like breathing for the first time after being underwater for too long. Every step forward was intoxicating. Signing the initial paperwork, registering the business name, even opening a separate bank account. It all felt like a declaration of independence. I was no longer the silent shadow behind Mark. I was my own. And every night, as I crossed off tasks on my growing list, I felt stronger, more certain that I was finally walking the path I was meant to follow. The hardest part was keeping my composure at work. There were days when I wanted to throw my resignation letter in his face, to expose him for the fraud he was. But I resisted. Timing mattered. If I left too soon, I would not be ready. If I stayed too long, I risked suffocating under his shadow. So I smiled through his fake compliments, delivered just enough to keep him off guard, and quietly built my exit behind the scenes. The more I prepared, the more his arrogance blinded him to the reality that his so-called visionary brilliance was nothing without me. Then came the final board presentation before I planned to leave. Mark was more smug than ever, strutting into the room as if he owned the future. He presented yet another lukewarm version of my ideas, and I watched the executives shift in their seats, their enthusiasm dimming. They were beginning to notice the shine had dulled. For once, there were no loud bursts of applause, no glowing compliments, just polite nods and quick glances at their watches. Mark left the meeting frowning, confused. I left the meeting smiling, certain. My plan was ready. His downfall was already underway. When I finally handed in my resignation, I kept it calm, professional, even gracious. Mark blinked at me in disbelief, as if he had never imagined I could walk away. He sputtered something about opportunities, about how much more we could achieve together. I simply told him that I was ready to explore something new. He tried to pry, but I gave him nothing. For the first time, the silence was mine, not his. I walked out of that office lighter than I had felt in years, carrying nothing but a small box of personal items and the unshakable certainty that I was free. The early months of building my company were brutal. Long nights, endless paperwork, setbacks I had not anticipated. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I had made a mistake. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the boardroom. I remembered Mark's smug smile, the sound of applause for something that was mine, and the suffocating weight of invisibility. That memory became fuel. Failure was terrifying, but the thought of returning to that shadow was unbearable. So I pushed through, learning, adapting, and finding strength I never knew I had. Momentum built slowly, then all at once. The investor introduced me to partners, the partners brought clients, and soon the blueprint I had scribbled at my kitchen table was alive in the world. The first contract signed felt surreal, like watching a dream materialize on paper. I framed it, not as a symbol of money, but as proof that my ideas had value, real, undeniable value. Word began to spread, opportunities multiplied, and for the first time, People were clapping not for Mark's voice echoing my thoughts, but for mine. The applause was different now. It was genuine. It was earned. Months later, I heard that Mark had tried to present yet another half-formed idea, and the board had cut him short. They were unimpressed, restless, and clearly losing faith in him. Rumors swirled that he was struggling, scrambling to prove he still had the brilliance they once admired. I could not help but smile when I heard the news. It was not revenge I wanted, but justice had a way of finding its place. His downfall was not orchestrated by me. It was inevitable. You cannot build a legacy on stolen ideas. Eventually, the truth reveals itself, and when it does, there is nothing left to hide behind. Success did not arrive in fireworks, but in steady, undeniable growth. Each month brought new challenges, but also new victories. I hired my first employee, then a small team, and suddenly the late nights at my kitchen table were replaced by mornings in a real office filled with energy and ideas. We were small, scrappy, and hungry, but the difference was unmistakable. Every person in that room knew exactly whose vision they were following. My name was on the door, my fingerprints on every strategy, and for the first time, I was not invisible. I was seen, respected, and trusted. Looking back, I realized how much of myself I had lost in that old job. I had shrunk in silence, convinced that safety came from keeping the peace, even as someone else consumed my light. But safety without respect is a cage, and no amount of salary or praise for someone else is worth the cost of your own worth. Walking away was terrifying, but it was the only way to breathe again. And once I did, I wondered why I had waited so long. One afternoon, long after my company had launched, I happened to run into Mark at a local event. He looked smaller somehow, his once confident stride dulled into a cautious shuffle. He asked me how I was doing, and when I told him, his eyebrows rose. He muttered something about being glad I was finding success, but his voice lacked conviction. In that moment, I saw it clearly. The man who once held power over me was now just another professional. No bigger than me, no brighter than me, because the brilliance he once carried had never been his in the first place. Walking away from him, I felt no bitterness, no anger, only clarity. I did not need revenge. I did not need the board to know the truth. My success was proof enough, and it spoke louder than any accusation ever could. The applause I had craved was no longer necessary, because the quiet confidence of standing in my own name was more satisfying than all the recognition in the world. I had won, not by tearing him down, but by finally standing tall myself. The journey taught me that ideas are powerful, but ownership of them is everything. You cannot wait for someone else to hand you permission, or recognition, or space to shine. If they refuse to give it, you must take it by creating your own. Every late night at the kitchen table, every dollar I saved, every risk I took carved the path to the life I wanted. And in the end, the only applause that mattered was my own. The inner voice that finally said, "You did it. This is yours." So if you ever find yourself trapped in the shadow of someone who steals your light, remember this. You do not have to fight them in their arena. You can build your own. And when you do, the applause will come, not for the person who tried to take credit, but for the one who dared to step out of silence and claim their own voice. That is where freedom begins. That is where real success lives.